when I started my working life, I started at a government research centre that was focused on road safety. And back in 1985 when I started, it was a really exciting time because it was around the time when we first started to see widespread introduction of child restraint systems and programs like the first introduction of random breath testing, and really just a much bigger investment in road safety and keeping people safe on the road. So I think this experience has really influenced me and the type of work that I now do at NeuRA. So when I think of cognitive health, what I think about is about keeping your head safe and really keeping you safe whenever you travel around in cars. So from my perspective, mobility is about keeping you safe, but it also really is key to healthy ageing. And for most of us, our primary means of getting around is in the car or some other form of on-road vehicle. So keeping safe in cars is also critical to active and independent healthy ageing. But currently, older people are overrepresented in crash statistics, with death and casualty rates among older people are almost as high as we see in the youngest people on our roads. And in fact, every year, on average, we see about 250 Australians aged 65 years and older dying as a result of a car crash, and more than 4,000 more are hospitalised. And one thing that we do know is that injuries and car crashes and the injuries that occur in car crashes can nearly always be prevented. And we know that if we want to keep people safe on the road, and if we want to reduce the number of people that are seriously injured and killed on the road, then we can do this by intervening at three different time points. We can try to prevent the crash from happening in the first place, or we can try to minimise the injury or the severity of the injury once a crash has occurred. And then when an injury does occur in a crash, we can make sure that we have the most effective trauma management systems in place. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is the work that we've been doing, and really what you can do as well to keep safe in cars from this second perspective, or in terms of occupant protection. So in our own lifetimes, we've really seen occupant protection come a very long way. And I think a really good example of this is a crash test that was carried out by the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety in the States a few years ago, where they took a 1959 model of a Chevrolet and a 2009 model of a Chevrolet, and they crashed them into each other. And I think this really is a very clear demonstration of how far occupant protection has come in the last 50 or 60 years. And these improvements really are about improved vehicle design and improved vehicle safety technologies. And this analysis, also from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, I think also provides us with a good understanding of what these improvements mean. Because you can see here in this red line on the graph, the actual reduction in fatality rates that have occurred in the US. And we've seen similar reductions here in Australia, and possibly even better reductions here in Australia. But the really interesting thing, I think, is the green line, which is estimating what that fatality rate would have been if we hadn't have seen the improvements in vehicle design and vehicle technologies that we have seen. And when we talk about vehicle design and safety technology improvements, what I'm talking about is things like improvement to the vehicle structure and technologies like airbags and seatbelts. And so today I'd just like to focus a little bit on the seatbelt itself. So this seems like a very simple bit of technology, but how it works is that it effectively ties a person to the vehicle so that they can make the best use of the vehicle ride down, which really means that they can make use of the crumple zones that are built into the car and come to a stop over the longest possible distance. And in doing this, the seatbelt also prevents ejection, and it prevents contact with the hard parts of the vehicle interior. But in doing its job, the seatbelt itself applies a force to the person's body. And so the seatbelt is specifically designed to apply these forces to the strongest parts of the body, which are the collarbone or the clavicle, the sternum or the chest bone, and the hard bony bits of the pelvis. And I think probably the best demonstration of how effective seatbelts are is to have a look at what happens when someone doesn't wear a seatbelt. And this footage I've got here today was kindly supplied by our friends at the New South Wales Centre for Road Safety. And you can see just how dramatic the motion that occurs in an unrestrained person in a crash. So while the seatbelt is doing this really good job of tying you to a car in a crash, it is applying these some forces to your body. And so for this reason, seatbelt fit and the position of the seatbelt is also really important for optimal protection in the crash. And this can sometimes be a little bit problematic because historically vehicles have been designed for the mid-sized, mid-aged male. And we've long understood that this can lead to problems associated with the mismatch between the size and the body shape of occupants in the case of children, for example, and that's why we have such a range of different types of child restraint systems. But at NeuRA, we've also recently started looking at other types of occupants who may also be having problems with seatbelt fit and positioning. And older people are one of these groups. And we're particularly interested in older people because we know that body shape changes as we age. And we've been really interested to see if this might be causing some problems in terms of belt fit and positioning. And this is also really important because we know that older people are up to 9 times more likely to be seriously injured in a crash than a younger person. And while a lot of this is likely to be associated with the increased frailty that occurs with ageing, because we know, for example, that our bones become less tolerant to impact as we age. But this increased risk of injury in a crash might also be influenced to some degree by poor seatbelt fit and positioning. So a few years ago, we conducted a study at NeuRA where we observed 380 older people, people that were 75 years and older, in their own vehicles, and we saw that only 30% of these had what we would call good overall seatbelt fit. And in fact, the vast majority had problems with the seatbelt being positioned too close to their neck or positioned too high across their abdomen, and in a lot of cases they had both these problems. And if we look at the problem of having a seatbelt too high, this is probably not going to be too much of a problem in a crash. But what it actually does is it increases discomfort. And we believe it likely increases the likelihood that people will move the position of the seatbelt. And in fact, in that sample of 380 drivers, around 1 in 5 told us that that's exactly what they do, reposition the belt because of comfort reasons. And a lot of them reported actually positioning the seatbelt under their arm or behind the back. And we know that this is a really bad thing to do because it really does increase the likelihood of serious injury in a crash. And it may well be obvious to you now why. Because the seatbelt is no longer applying those forces to the strongest parts of the body. And I do have some more footage from the Centre for Road Safety that demonstrates the dangers that are associated with this type of mispositioning. And as you watch this footage, you can see that the seatbelt is no longer applying those loads to the clavicle and the hard part of the mid-chest. And instead, it's the soft abdomen and lower ribs that are being loaded. So what can you do if the sash belt is rubbing your neck? Well, in most modern cars, there's a lot of adjustments that you can make to the vehicle that can help with seatbelt fit. And the most simple of these is the seatbelt height adjusters that you can find on the B pillar just near where the front door closes. But unfortunately, many of the older people that we've spoken to, and in fact a lot of younger people as well, don't realise that these adjusters are there or what they can be used for. And we also saw in our observation study that the people who don't use these height adjusters are the ones that are most likely to have problems with sash belt fit. So for problems with the lap belt sitting too high on your abdomen, this really does have a negative impact on the protection provided in a crash. And the reason for this might now be obvious, because in this position, the lap belt's not going to be distributing the forces over the hard pelvis, and instead it's already positioned over the soft abdomen, which increases the risk of injury to this region, as well as to the thoracic and lumbar spine. And in many cases, this type of poor positioning can easily be improved by simply making sure that when you get in a car, you position the lap belt under the belly. So while we did see a lot of older people with poor seatbelt fit and poor positioning, as we had expected, we think a lot of this can really easily be improved by better education, of simply how to position seatbelts properly and how to use the already available seatbelt adjusters in modern cars. But in that same study, we did make one somewhat surprising observation. And this was that about a third of the older drivers in this sample were also using some sort of comfort accessory in the car, like pillows and cushions on the vehicle seat and different types of things behind their backs, as well as a whole myriad of fluffy things on the seatbelt sash. So we think it's very likely that these fluffy type things on the sash won't have any effect on the performance of a seatbelt in a crash. But we think it is highly likely that some of the things that we saw people putting on the seats could have a negative impact on the protection provided in a crash. But we actually don't know this for sure yet, because no one else has actually looked at this before. So in ongoing work at NeuRA, we're trying to solve these problems, and we're developing the first ever set of guidelines for orthopaedic and comfort aids in cars. And we're doing this by surveying some more older Australians, as well as talking to a whole lot of different clinicians, and conducting a really large crash test series in our Transurban Road Safety Centre at NeuRA, so that we'll know for the first time really what sorts of devices are safe to use in cars and what sorts of things should never be used in cars. So we hope to have these guidelines ready by the end of the year. But in the meantime, if you are suffering from any comfort issues in the car, I really think the best thing to do is to seek some advice from car dealers or your mechanic or even family and friends about how to make adjustments to your vehicle and to your vehicle seat that might help to resolve some of these problems. And so I suppose I really got 5 take-home messages from today and 5 things that I'd like you to remember when you leave. And the first of these are that seatbelts really are a highly effective technology and they should always be used. But seatbelt positioning is also really important for to get the best possible crash protection. And if you or somebody that you know is having problems with the seatbelt rubbing on their neck, then you can simply in most cars, you'll simply be able to fix this by making some adjustment to the sash belt height. And the fourth thing I'd like you to remember is that the position of the lap belt part of the seat belt is also really important. And so always try to keep this as low as possible when you get into a car. Position it down below your belly and hopefully in contact with your thighs. And lastly, if you are having some comfort issues in the car, in the meantime, before we have our guidelines ready, the best advice I can give you is to seek advice. Talk to your car dealers or your mechanics and family and friends about what sorts of adjustments you might already be able to make in your car to improve any comfort issues you might be having. And finally, the road traffic injury problem is not just a problem for older people. And the injury prevention research work we do at NeuRA is much broader than what I've talked about today, because globally more than 5 million people die every year from injury, and almost a quarter of this injury can be attributed to road traffic injuries. So we're working across the full spectrum of of technologies that will help to prevent crashes amongst motorcyclists and older drivers. We're trying to optimise crash protection for older drivers and children as well as motorcyclists. And we're also working with clinicians at the Children's Hospital to try and make sure we have the most effective trauma management systems in place for the most common injuries we see among children from road traffic crashes. So thank you for your time.